Well, a warm welcome to this video as always. And the subject I want to talk about today is really of quite profound importance, because I've found out that there's good evidence-based studies that vitamin D reduces the probability of contracting respiratory tract infections, both respiratory infections that are bacterial in origin and respiratory infections that are viral in origin. Vitamin D does help to prevent those. Vitamin D supplements. So this is just something like this. These happen to be from Asda, but they could be from anywhere. I've no financial interest in it. Now, these aren't multivitamins, they're just vitamin D on their own. Now, if you want to stop this video now, you can, because I've told you what I wanted to tell you. Vitamin D supplement, for the vast majority of people, will reduce the likelihood of them getting respiratory tract bacterial infections, respiratory tract viral infections, and it can also make those infections much less serious as well. So switch off now if you want, but if you want to follow this in more detail, and it's very interesting and quite a few extra bits to give you as well, come along with me now. So the thing here is vitamin D increases the immune response. Vitamin D increases immunity. Now, where do we get vitamin D from? Well, it's in these foods, fatty foods. The fat-soluble vitamins are A, D, E and K, the so-called ADEK vitamins. And we get them in these foods. But basically, vitamin D, we get most of it from sunshine exposing to our skin. It's produced in the skin as a result of sun exposure, vitamin D. And the darker the coloured skin, the more slowly you will produce vitamin D. Now, one of the reasons I'm convinced this is important is the only reason I can think of for being white. The only biological adaptive reason for being white is that white skin produces vitamin D more quickly, because when we migrated up to northern latitudes we evolved white skin. So the original humans would have dark coloured skin from Africa to protect from the sun, but then as we migrated north we needed to produce more vitamin D more quickly in the faint northern sunlight, so that's why our skins went white. I don't know of any other biological advantage at all to being white, so I think this vitamin D thing is of really major importance, because it explains why some people have got white skin, apart from anything else. So it's in these foods, but we get most of it from sunshine. It's basically the sunshine. And vitamin D deficiency has been linked to increased severity of viral infections and bacterial infections. So this is really very important. Supplements reduce the risk of contracting respiratory tract infections. Now, this is not me talking rubbish, these are evidence-based statements. And I'm going to give you that evidence now, but just think about how profound that is. Supplements reduce the risk of contracting respiratory tract infections. Supplements of vitamin D. Now, vitamin D, this is the paper this is taken from. Vitamin D supplementation to prevent acute respiratory tract infections, systemic review and meta-analysis of individual participant data. Now, what this means, this is British Medical Journal, by the way. This is top drawer stuff. This is not some rubbish. This is proper research. Now, a meta-analysis takes many different studies and combines the data and reprocesses that data to give an overall result. And the studies from that are usually very accurate. It's a very good form of research. So this is good research that we're dealing with here. Now, observational studies report associations between low serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D. So that is the type of vitamin D in the blood, 25-hydroxyvitamin D that you get in the blood. The major circulating vitamin D metabolite that circulates in the blood. So observational studies report associations between low vitamin D and susceptibility to acute respiratory tract infections. So you're going to get more respiratory tract infections if you are low on vitamin D. That's what this study is saying. And the aim of this study was to assess the overall effect of vitamin D supplementation on the risk of acute respiratory tract infections. That's what this is testing. And it's a meta-analysis of randomised double-blind placebo-controlled trials. Now, these are the best sorts of trials. They're randomised double-blind placebo-controlled trials. And this took data from several of them together, with supplementation with these two forms of vitamin D. But the body converts these forms of vitamin D into a more active form anyway. And the number in this study, the N, was 10,933. That is a lot. That is a big study. This is high quality data. So this took many studies together. And what these studies were, they were randomised double-blind controlled trials. So that means there was one group here that received the extra vitamin D supplement, and they were compared with a group here that didn't get the vitamin D supplement but were treated in every way the same, and they were given a placebo. So they compared that group there that got the vitamin D, that group there that got the placebo, and they found that this group got less chest infections, and their chest infections were often less severe. It's quite a profound result. So if we go on and look at these results in detail, we see that the overall protective effect of vitamin D supplementation against acute respiratory tract infection is given a number here. Now, this was a meta-analysis, so what they did was took quite a few different studies, a lot of different studies, and combined them. Now, some of these different studies were giving vitamin D in a bolus dose, like every month or every 2 months or every 3 months. Other studies were giving vitamin D every week. Other studies were giving vitamin D every day. That's what I do. I'm taking one of these a day over winter, and indeed we'll look at evidence that says you should take it all year round if you live in England, especially the north of England. Now, what they did was they took the people that were taking the vitamin D as a bolus every few months, the ones that were taking it weekly and the ones that were taking it daily, and they found that overall the adjusted odds ratio was 0.88. Now, if the adjusted odds ratio, this is all research speak, but if the adjusted odds ratio equals 1, then that means there's no harmful effect and there's no protective effect. But if the adjusted odds ratio is less than 1, that shows there's a protective effect. So 88 is less than 1, 0.88 is less than 1, so that shows there's a 12% protective effect. 12% protective effect overall. In other words, looking at all the people that had the vitamin D supplement, they got 12% less chest infections, both bacterial and viral chest infections, just through taking vitamin D. And this result is significant. P equals 0.05. That means there's only a 5% chance that the result could have arisen by chance. They believe it's a genuine result. So we see that for everyone in the group there's a 12% protective effect. But then they went on to look at subgroups, and what they found was if the benefit was greatest in those receiving daily or weekly vitamin D without additional bolus doses. In other words, they found that taking the bolus doses had some benefit, but they found that the people in the study that were taking the vitamin D weekly or daily had a greater effect, a greater protective effect. And their adjusted odds ratio was 0.81. So that's a 19% protective effect. So what this study shows is people taking vitamin D every day get 19% less respiratory viral infections and 19% less bacterial respiratory infections. It's protecting against viral and bacterial respiratory infections. Just by taking a vitamin D tablet, you're reducing your chances of getting it by 19%, which is quite significant. Now, a lot of people don't have enough vitamin D, and they found that the protective effect against acute respiratory tract infections was strongest in those who were already profoundly vitamin D deficient when they measured them. Now, what they did was they said blood levels of less than 25 nanomoles per litre represents profound vitamin D deficiency. And when they gave those people the daily or weekly vitamin D supplementation, they found the adjusted odds ratio was 0.3. In other words, these people who were vitamin D deficiency, once the vitamin D deficiency was corrected, got 70% less chest infections, whether caused by viruses or bacteria. So overall, including bolus doses, 12%. So we know not to give bolus doses. We know to give the tablets daily or weekly. And if you're not short of vitamin D, this is saying that you'll get a 19% benefit from taking extra vitamin D. 19% less chances of getting these infections. But if you're short of vitamin D, as many of us are, in northern latitudes, especially in winter, we get a 70% protective effect. 70% less likely to get these infections. This is really quite an impressive result. And they also said, this team, vitamin D supplementation was safe and it protected against acute respiratory tract infection overall, but it was safe. Patients who were very deficient in vitamin D and not receiving the bolus doses experienced the greatest benefit, 70% less likely to get viral or bacterial chest infections. I'm impressed. I'm really impressed. These findings support introduction of public health measures such as food fortified with vitamin D to improve vitamin D status, particularly in settings where profound vitamin D deficiency is common. Northern latitudes, and especially people in northern latitudes with darker coloured skins. But anyone living in the northern latitudes over winter is going to be low on vitamin D. So this is quite impressive. We should be taking this extra vitamin D. So now the dosage is a bit confusing sometimes because vitamin D is sometimes measured in micrograms. So you can see that one there I'm taking is 25 micrograms. And sometimes it's measured in IUs, international units. Now, to be fair, the international unit system is probably a bit old-fashioned now. So I prefer to use the microgram way of thinking about it. But 1 microgram is 40 international units. So I'm taking 25 micrograms and that equals 1,000 international units. And the guidelines now is all adults living in the UK should take a supplement containing 400 international units, that's 10 micrograms of vitamin D, throughout the year. And that's not me, that's the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Nice. This is what that is recommending. And if we do this, we can expect to get a significant reduction in our likelihood of getting viral or bacterial respiratory tract infections. Safety. Vitamin D does not increase the risk of serious adverse events or harm. And again, this is from well over 10,000 patients that were analysed in this meta-analysis. No increased risk of death. So this team, based on data from over 10,000 patients, are saying this is safe to do. It's a safe thing to do, but with this potential huge benefit. Now, some recognised complications of vitamin D. One is high calcium, hypercalciemia in the blood. And that incidence of that was 0.5% in the experiment, in the groups. And renal stones is another complication that people sometimes talk about, of 0.2%. But the point is, this was the same in both groups. So whether the people were taking the extra vitamin D to get the immunological boost, or whether they were taking the placebo, didn't make any difference to these side effects. They both got the same. In other words, these complications that are sometimes associated with taking vitamin D were not associated with the vitamin D. They were the same in both groups. They were the same in the group taking the vitamin D, and then the same in the placebo group. So the hyperglycemia in the vitamin D group was 0.5%. The hypercalcemia was 0.5% in the group taking vitamin D, and the hypercalcemia in the group taking the placebo was also 0.5%. And the same for the renal stone. So basically they're saying that's not a problem. No significant increase no significant increase in risk or adverse events with either bolus dosing or daily weekly supplementation. So what they're saying is you don't get adverse events with either, but the weekly or the daily supplementation is better for preventing infections. Why is this important? Well, acute respiratory tract infections are so common. I mean, last few years I've been working in A&E, and you get so many people in accident and emergency with respiratory tract infections all the time. It's really, really common. So it's a major cause of global morbidity, that's disease, and mortality, that's death. In the United States, it's responsible for 10% of emergency department visits, and it's probably much the same from my experience working in accident and emergency in the UK. It caused more than 2.5 million deaths worldwide in 2013. So, this is killing people, and vitamin D can reduce this by up to 70% in low risk groups. Stimulates immunity to viral and bacterial infections. So this is working by stimulating the immune system. That's why it's working against viral infections, and that's why it's working against bacterial infections, making these respiratory infections less likely to occur. Now, why is this happening? What's the rationale? Well, vitamin D reduces the scope of the acquired immune response. Right, okay. So what this is saying is, sometimes when people have chest infections, there's a problem called ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. And what happens here is we have the small bronchial passages, and these break down into other smaller bronchial passages, and these break down into these large clusters of air sacs called the alveoli, like this. The alveoli. Now, when there's viral or bacterial infection here, this causes inflammation. And the inflammation is partly caused by the presence of the virus or bacteria, but it's also largely caused by the body's immunological response to the virus or bacteria. And what that means is this inflammatory response means that the inflammatory response produces lots of inflammatory fluids, and these fluids collect in the alveoli like this. And they also collect in the spaces between the blood vessels. That's the blood vessels with the blood cells going through there. The fluid collects in that space there. So this stops the oxygen going into the blood, and it stops the carbon dioxide going from the blood back into the alveoli to be breathed out. So it reduces this disproportionate imbalance in the body's own immunological reaction. So vitamin D reduces the scope of the acquired immune response, and it stops this extreme response. So in ARDS, the problem is actually caused by the body's immune system overreacting rather than by the infection in itself, and vitamin D will prevent this or help to reduce this complication. Vitamin D is essential for regeneration of the epithelial barrier. So lining the inside of the respiratory tract, we have this layer of epithelium, the respiratory epithelium, and vitamin D promotes the health of that respiratory epithelium. And if the respiratory epithelium is intact, if all those cells are nice and healthy, that helps to keep the bugs out, the viruses and the bacteria out as well. And vitamin D is also involved in the maturation of the immune cells. So lymphocytes, neutrophils, monocytes, dendritic cells, these are all immunological cells. These ones are in the blood, these ones are in the tissues, but they're all immunological cells. They are all white blood cells called lymphocytes, or these dendritic cells are derived from lymphocytes, and they all respond to vitamin D. They have vitamin D receptors. So it seems that lack of vitamin D is adversely affecting all of these immunological cells. And not only that, low levels of vitamin D are associated with risks of various types of cancer. And it's also possible that low vitamin D is associated with heart disease and multiple sclerosis and some types of diabetes, but that's for another video. So what we're saying here is, this is really quite profound, that vitamin D supplement will reduce the likelihood of developing acute respiratory tract infection. And if you're deficient of vitamin D at the moment, as many of us are, vitamin D supplement will profoundly reduce your risk of getting acute respiratory tract infection.